Next, I want to talk a little bit about some elements of cultural geography. And the introduction to the course, we talked about how the geography is often divided into physical and cultural geography. So I want to, this is a part of the world where culture and language and the development of culture is very important. So I want to highlight that for a moment and introduce a concept called the cultural landscape. And it's a part of the world where you have a blending of the natural environment and how humans interact with that natural environment. So humans, one thing humans do, and by the way, this thing about environmental determinism, that environmental determinism was kind of an old way of thinking about humans in their relation to the environment. And it's kind of, and I think it's fair to say, kind of a racist thought that was around during the colonial period that kind of said that people were, their culture was created by the environment that they lived in. So if you lived in a warm climate, you may not be as productive because it's too hot. Or if you lived in a cold, whatever. But the reality is that humans adapt and utilize resources in these environments. They exploit opportunities and they deal with extremes, and they're not, the environment does not shape them. They interact with the environment, and it's not deterministic. People can adapt in different ways. I think these pictures are from Northern Sudan and South Sudan, and these are two different places where people have adapted in different ways, and for example, how they create their homes. And one way that people have adapted is through how they've adapted through the agricultural revolution that we've talked about. And we've mentioned this idea before about cultural hearths. We talked about the Mesoamerican and Andean cultural hearths. And as a reminder, these are places where civilizations emerged following the domestication of growing their own food from seeds. And we do have very old examples, some of the oldest in this part of the world, including Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. We'll also talk about the West Africa later. But right now I want to focus on Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. Mesopotamia, also sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, mostly the country of Iraq and nearby, and the Nile River, the Nile Valley, which is almost exclusively in Egypt. It might extend a little bit into the country south of there, but Egypt is primarily where we find this. This is a kind of a graphic showing kind of a timeline of different civilizations. And so just for an example, the Mayan was a relatively old civilization in the Americas, but it's relatively young compared to something like Mesopotamia, which is thousands of years old, or Egypt, which also is something on the order of 5,000 to 6,000 years old. So these cultural hearts in this part of the world are very old. And so let's just review. We've talked about the Paleolithic, the Stone Age, during the Ice Ages or the Pleistocene, where people lived by hunting and gathering. They had to range over wide landscapes to get enough resources, and they had to live in small groups because of the amount of resources that were in the environment. And then with the agricultural revolution, we started using domestication, controlling the breeding and cultivation of plants. And one side effect is that increased the carrying capacity. How big of a group humans, how many humans can live together? Because when you have intensive land use, that you're intensively growing food, you can feed more people and more of them can live close by. And that's what's happening at these cultural hearths, particularly in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, that these are really started or promoted because of domestication. And previously, one thing that we've discussed is how dry, that this is a relatively dry part of the world. And because of that, domestication is only useful if you have access to water. And so what we find is that these cultural hearths are in places where there is access to water. In Mesopotamia, this is what's called the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These are critically important rivers as for water supply in this part of the world. So this is Mesopotamia, generally speaking, most of it in Iraq, but some of it extending into Turkey and Syria and nearby countries. Here's another view of it. This is showing some ancient archaeological sites of old cities that sprung up in this part of the world. And this really, I'd like you to know these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And the importance of these two rivers is they provide irrigation. Because this part of the world is very dry, irrigation is a requirement. You need access to a water source. You can't rely on rain. Likewise, we have in Egypt, move that down a bit, we have the Nile River. And the Nile River is probably a little more familiar, well known. And the Nile River would seasonally flood. It would, it would flood over its banks. And that actually provided two gifts. One is the water itself, but a second one is that it provided a lot of nutrients that were washed down from the interior of Africa. Because the Nile River originates high in the mountains of Africa, and where you have volcanically rich soils, and it washes a lot of those rich, nutritious soils. And when it floods, it deposits the silt or sediment that makes the ground more productive. When you get outside of this band along the river, this flood zone, it's extremely hostile environment of the Sahara. Here's an aerial view of this band of agriculture along the edge of the Nile River. And you can see you don't have to go too far beyond this little band, and you're into some very difficult and hostile environments. And I do want you to know this topic, and it's called hydraulic civilization theory. And it goes along, so let's recap. We have a few things going on. We have a relatively dry environment where you can't count on rainfall to grow your crops. So each farmer is not able to just live on their own and rely on rainfall. So irrigation becomes incredibly important. However, irrigation requires a organized society, and it also involves the creation of power. So what happens in hydraulic civilization theory is that cities emerge as centers of control because they can control irrigation, thus controlling the food supply. So these cities, these ancient cities that emerge in this part of the world gain power over the food supply and help organize the labor needed to develop the irrigation system. So the point being, because while the environment does not determine culture, people interact with the environment, right? It's relatively dry part of the world, so people have to adapt to that. One adaptation is the development of irrigation, but one side effect is that people organize their societies in ways to manage that type of a system. And that's what hydraulic civilization theory is about. So make sure you understand that concept. Now, hold that down a little bit. Now, with the Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, we're mostly talking about irrigation directly from surface waters of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, or from the Nile River in the Nile Valley. There are some other unique adaptations that have happened as well, utilizing groundwater, and one in particular is the use of Qanats. And I'll include a video. You really have to kind of see this visually to get to appreciate what a marvel of engineering these things are. So normally when we drill a well, say in Clovis, what we would do is drill a pipe straight down into the ground until we hit groundwater, but then we would have to use electric or diesel pumps to get the water out. These Qanats go back 2,000 or more years when they didn't have these types of technologies. So what they did was something very creative. As it so happens, you can drill down to hit water, but if you're in a mountainous landscape, the groundwater actually will curve along the mountains. So people figured out that they could tunnel directly far into mountains, and at some point they would hit groundwater. And if the tunnel was built just right, that groundwater would come out very slowly and very gently, but would just keep going and going and going. If they're well maintained and done right, you can have the slow access of water from inside the mountain. And because it's moving by gravity, because of the slight slope, there's no need for any kind of pumps, no diesel, no electric, whatever. The water's moved by gravity from the interior of the mountain slowly out into the landscape. Here's another picture of this. Here's the first, people go down, they hit groundwater, and then from there they kind of keep, they dig down and dig sideways until they tap that groundwater and get it all the way to an outlet where it can be distributed through little ditches and gates and small canals and things. And that's another source of irrigation. These were common in parts of Iran. So in Iran, you don't have a major river like you do in the Mesopotamia or the Nile. So in Iran, people had to be more creative in utilizing what they had. They had mountains, they had groundwater within those mountains. So the Qanats is another unique adaptation to this dry environment.